In December of 1922, the whole of Ireland, except for Northern Ireland, gained autonomy from Great Britain as a dominion of the British Empire, as agreed in the Anglo-Irish Treaty, which put an end to the Irish War for Independence. In 1937, Ireland drafted a new constitution which made them effectively independent, and the British royal family lost the last of their powers over Ireland in 1949. This was an extremely significant shift in the long and complicated relationship between England/Britain and Ireland. A relationship which, for a long time, involved the rule of Ireland by Britain in a fairly colonial fashion. Most people know how this story ended, or partially ended if you consider Northern Ireland, but far fewer people know how it began. For that, we have to go quite a bit further back, all the way back to the Anglo-Norman invasion of Ireland in the 12th century. Early medieval Ireland was a land of kings. There were lots of kings. You had sub-kings over small territories, over-kings above them, provincial over-kings, and even high kings who claimed dominion over the whole of Ireland. The provincial over-kings were often the most significant in the 12th century. You had kings of Leinster, Ossory, Meath, Connacht, etc. The idea of the high king was quite old, but the ability of one king to impose himself over all others was not always a reality. In the past, there'd been some dynasties who'd managed to pass on high kingship peacefully, but after around 1022, the rank of high king was something that had to be acquired through war, which meant two things: that there could be two or more men claiming to be high king simultaneously, and that the high king often had less power over the other Irish kings than he had in the past. Even in the past, though, we shouldn't think of the high king of Ireland to really be the king of Ireland. The other Irish kings were his clients, but he didn't have absolute power over them, let alone their lands and resources. It was more of a contract between two rulers. The situation was similar to that of the Anglo-Saxon kings prior to the late 9th century, which I've actually made a whole video about. The biggest difference being that for the Irish, the idea of a single high king over all the Irish was much more widely accepted, and it was seen as an ideal norm, while also being more often a reality. Early medieval Ireland was also a thoroughly Christian land, at least by the 12th century. It's unlikely that there were any non-Christians living there since the 8th century at the absolute latest. The exception to this were Vikings who settled in Ireland starting in the 9th century, but by the 12th they had converted to Christianity as well. England was also thoroughly Christian, but it was part of something bigger as well. By the 12th century, there had been a couple of very important trends affecting English society. First of all, there had been a great degree of Frankification. By that I mean that Frankish culture and institutions had spread into England and influenced English culture, even before the Norman conquest of 1066. Obviously, though, when Duke William of Normandy, a man whose culture was thoroughly Frankish, conquered England to become its king, this Frankification increased dramatically. So, what is Frankification? Well, it was lots of things. A centralized kingship, succession by primogeniture, written charters and contracts, feudal relations between the king and his subjects, meaning the king, or any lord really, gave land to a warrior who sustained himself with it in exchange for a fixed sort of military service. It also meant a greater degree of commercialization of agriculture. People developed land to be as commercially profitable as possible, which also meant a bigger emphasis on clearing land for grain. It meant a growing importance of bureaucracy and bureaucratic offices, increased emphasis on towns and an urban burgher class, castles, knights, and much, much more. Essentially, all the classic staples of the High Middle Ages. I say Frankish because these developments began in the Frankish realms, namely France and the Holy Roman Empire, and they came about with attempts to revive Roman law and custom there in the 8th and 9th centuries, and then especially in the 11th and 12th centuries, by which point England was also an active player in these developments. Likewise, they didn't only spread to England, but rather across the Latin Christian world. This brings me to the second trend, the changes in the Catholic Church. In the 11th century, a movement in the Roman Church known as the Gregorian Reforms would have a huge impact on medieval society. I'll have to make a separate video on this at some point, but for now I'll go over things briefly. Among other things, these reforms placed a big emphasis on the authority of the Pope, the Bishop of Rome. Now, the Pope had always been revered and held a high status, but this movement placed him on the very top. What the Pope decided in terms of theology or church custom was canon. He was the arbitrator of proper Christianity. This is what ultimately led to the schism in 1054 between what we today call the Catholic and Orthodox churches. England had always had a pretty strong connection to Rome, because the conversion of the English had been done for the most part by missionaries sent directly by popes, specifically Pope Gregory the Great. But many churches which acknowledged papal importance and revered the Pope had grown more organically and developed many of their own customs. And this was the case in Ireland, but also Spain and amongst early Slavic converts like Great Moravia. However, the Gregorian reforms encouraged conformity to Roman norms, and especially to the Latin liturgical rite, which is one of the reasons why we refer to the Catholic world in the Middle Ages as Latin Europe or Latin Christendom. That isn't to say that people following other rites didn't use Latin. The Irish always had. But the Latin rite refers to the specific customs and ways of doing things based on how it was done in Rome. Alright, so what does this have to do with England invading Ireland? Well, a lot, actually, because both of these trends affected how the English viewed Ireland, which is extremely important for understanding why they invaded. I talked about this a bit in a video I made earlier this year about how Ireland was perceived as a land of wonder and mystery by outsiders in the Middle Ages, where I went over Gerald of Wales's Topographia Hibernica. In that video, I promised I'd one day make a video on the Anglo-Norman invasion, and that's exactly what I'm doing now. You don't have to watch that video to understand this one, and in fact there'll be some overlap, but they definitely complement each other. Anyway, England's participation in this Latin Frankish culture led the English to see themselves as part of a civilized core. They were the heirs to Rome, both the Rome of Caesar and the Rome of St. Peter, the stone upon which Christ would build his church. Those outside of the civilized core were then barbarians, and to the English mind, the Irish were definitely barbarians. Now, here we have to make a distinction between reality and perception, because the English perceived the Irish to be barbarians based on a skewed, stereotyped view, which didn't always reflect the historical reality, though it was often based on an exaggeration of reality. In the English mind, Ireland was a land stuck in the past. It wasn't centralized, and the holding of power was weak and chaotic. They looked at the wars over the High Kingship and concluded that the Irish were excessively violent, greedy, vengeful, and untrustworthy. They had no law, they were cowards and backstabbers, the former being the reason for the latter. But again, this was their perception based on their understanding of what they saw, through the biased lens of assuming them to be uncivilized, and packing on other classically barbarian traits out of an expectation of what a barbarian was. Ireland was also considered to be a wild land, full of dense forests and uncultivated. The Irish only hunted and herded and hardly ever grew crops, let alone have any towns. This, of course, is an exaggeration based on the fact that the English were hyper-focused on the importance of landholding, grain cultivation, and urban centers. The Irish did, in fact, grow grain, and they focused on it more and more by the 12th century, but it wasn't as intensive as in England, and most rural farmers lived off of a larger variety of resources, including foraging from dense forests and marshlands, of which there were indeed many. The Irish did also have towns, though they were usually smaller than those in England, but they existed for local trade. There were also bigger towns which did international trade, like Dublin, Wexford, and Limerick, which had been founded by those Viking settlers I mentioned earlier, who had integrated into Irish culture and society, and are often referred to as Norse Gaels or Hiberno-Norse, Hiberno coming from Hibernia, the Latin name for Ireland. Many of these stereotypes of Irish barbarism, including others like that they're hypersexual and prone to bestiality, really got going especially once the invasion had already begun. It was a form of othering, drawing a firm line between civilized, orderly conquerors and the savage, chaotic conquered. but they did also exist to an extent even before this time. Some of the most significant stereotypes, however, and those which were most prevalent before the invasion, were related to Christianity in Ireland. Like I said before, the Irish Church showed great reverence for the papacy. They weren't just isolated from the rest of the world doing their own thing. In fact, they were even responsive to the Gregorian reforms. In the 12th century, Irish kings and bishops agreed to divide all of Ireland into 4 archdioceses, and these even further into regular dioceses, creating a fixed church hierarchy into which every single church had a clear place. There were also attempts to ensure clerical celibacy, including forbidding men who would become priests after already having a family from living with their wives, which may have been inspired by the hard stance the popes had been taking on the matter of married clergy. But despite this, the Irish Church was perceived as being deviant. Their liturgy was still not quite up to snuff with that of Rome. Now, not conforming to every Roman norm was not inherently evil or anything. You weren't necessarily going to hell just because you sang different prayers at Mass or sang them in a different order. But lack of liturgical conformity was seen as suspicious, because it led to questions of how loyal the Irish really were to Rome, and therefore made them vulnerable to accusations of heresy and religious backwardness. By the 12th century, the Mozarabic rite in Spain had been replaced by the Roman, at least in Christian-held lands, and the Slavonic rite was being attacked in Bohemia. Liturgical unity was becoming expected. Again, the perception of major deviation wasn't always based in reality. All the way back in the 7th century, there'd been a controversy between Irish and English churchmen over how to calculate the date of Easter. Ultimately, the Irish would conform to the Roman way followed by the English, with the important churches of Armagh adopting it all the way back in the 680s and Iona in 716. But the distant memory of Irish deviance played into English perceptions of the Irish Church. These ideas of religious deviance blended with those of barbarism to the point where Bernard of Clairvaux could infamously call the Irish Christians in name but pagan in fact. Civilization meant proper Christianity, so barbarity had to mean the opposite. One of the things that justified the label of barbarian in the minds of many was the fact that Irish kings frequently had multiple wives. In my other video, I mistakenly said that Irish church law allowed plural marriage, but it didn't actually. The church only acknowledged one of the king's wives. What I meant to say, though, is that the church hadn't taken marriage into its own hands, something the Gregorian reforms pushed for, and so marriage was governed by secular law, which allowed for plural marriage. This was seen as a failure of the Irish Church. One of its biggest failures, however, according to outsiders, was its inability, or unwillingness, to provide pastoral care. This was a stereotype removed from reality, but for Latin churchmen, this was seen as the origin for all of the other perceived moral faults of the Irish. And this was actually a big concern of the Gregorian reforms, the idea that many of the problems in society at the time were due to priests being poor shepherds to their flock, either because they were ignorant of proper theology or because they didn't care about their duties. It was and remains a common trope amongst reformers. We can't underestimate how much of a big deal this would have been to the church at the time, because people who weren't properly cared for by their priests were at risk of damnation. A church which didn't hear confession and give penance, which was run by isolated monks who spent all day drinking and hardly ever interacted with the laity, as the stereotypes went, was a social danger. So that was the contrast in the minds of the Anglo-Normans in the 12th century. And, by the way, just so it's clear, we often say Anglo-Norman because of the fact that the English nobility were largely culturally Norman at this time. Many would be speaking French as their first language, although English was becoming more and more common amongst those who had fewer ties to mainland Europe. Speaking of which, I think it's probably about time that I finally start talking about the actual invasion now. Well, in the 12th century, the Hiberno-Norse towns of Wexford, Waterford, and Dublin were extremely important for trade in the Irish Sea. Because of this, everyone around them wanted to have some influence, but they wanted to maintain their own autonomy. This was especially the case for Dublin, which retained its own Hiberno-Norse king, who, by the end of the century, was a sub-king of the King of Leinster, Dermot MacMurcha, who also controlled the other two. This situation led King Henry II of England to form a close bond with Diarmait, ensuring that the Irish seaports would be welcoming to him. But Dublin especially sought ways to remain autonomous from the Irish kings which were constantly trying to subjugate it. And one of the ways said Irish kings tried to do that was by controlling the bishopric of Dublin. So, Dublin and its bishop created closer ties with England, and from 1074 to 1121, the Bishop of Dublin was actually consecrated by the Archbishop of Canterbury. Fast forward to 1152, however, and the Synod of Kells-Melliford, one of those cooperative Irish reform councils, which was sanctioned by a papal legate, placed Dublin under the authority of the Archbishop of Armagh, a decision which sat poorly with the English Church. 2 years later, though, in 1154, Dublin was captured by prospective High King Muireatach MacLachlan. In response to this, Henry II sought papal sanction for military intervention. That same year, 1154, saw the election of the first and only ever English pope, Hadrian IV, who was presumably quite familiar with the situation, including the snubbing of Canterbury's authority over Dublin and with views of the English Church towards the Irish. In the following year, in the papal bull Laudabiliter, he sanctioned an English conquest of Ireland, with the explicit stated purpose of saving the faith of the Irish and bringing its church into conformity with the Gregorian reforms. Military intervention was seen as the best way forward. But by 1156, things had calmed down, and Diarmait had begun to support MacLachlan, who had by now declared himself High King, and so Henry didn't intervene. The situation changed, though, 10 years later when MacLachlan's rival, Ruaidhrí Ó Crochar, killed MacLachlan, declared himself High King, took Dublin, and drove Diarmait MacMurcha into exile. Diarmait then turned to Henry and asked him for help in recovering his kingdom, to which Henry gave him permission to recruit from amongst his people. And so that's exactly what Diarmait did, returning to Leinster in 1167 with English troops. However, it was in 1169 when the Anglo-Norman Count of Striguil in Wales, Richard Fitzgilbert de Clare, better known today by his nickname Strongbow, sailed to Leinster with an army of knights and helped Diarmait reclaim his kingdom. To thank Strongbow, and to ensure a lasting bond between the two, Diarmait offered the hand of his daughter Aoife in marriage. Diarmait died not long after in 1171, and Strongbow succeeded as king of Leinster. It's unclear whether this was the plan all along, since Diarmait had other living sons and grandsons, but regardless, that's what ultimately happened. This worried Henry a bit, and later that same year, he landed in Ireland to take control of the Irish Sea port cities and ensure Strongbow's submission to him. Strongbow did indeed submit, but he wasn't the only one. Henry spent the winter in Dublin and received several Irish kings who recognized his authority. Why? Well, they could have done so for any number of reasons. Some of them may have been intimidated by Henry's power and submitted out of fear. Others might have been allies of MacLachlan's and recognized Henry as their new High King in opposition to Ruaidhrí. Anyone who might have been chased out of their own lands like Diarmait could have used this as a way to bolster their own authority, or even take their kingdom back, especially those whose kingdoms were small and whose opponents would likely cave at the very thought of an Anglo-Norman intervention. It's likely that most of them were simply playing the same political game as they had in the past, assuming the King of England would treat them just as any other High King would. Henry couldn't afford to stick around in Ireland forever, but he also didn't fully trust Strongbow. So, as he left in 1172, he granted Meath to Hugh de Lacy in hope of creating a counterbalance to Strongbow. This didn't go down all too well with the locals, especially the King of Meath, who hadn't even submitted to Henry, and they didn't seem to be all too happy with Strongbow either, who was still fighting to solidify control in Leinster. So, when Henry called Strongbow to help him deal with a rebellion supported by France, and a large number of troops left Ireland along with him, several Gaelic uprisings began in both kingdoms. This was ended in 1175 by an agreement between Henry and Ruaidhrí Ó Crochar, the Peace of Windsor, in which Henry agreed to allow Ruaidhrí to hold his lands in peace, as long as Ruaidhrí ensured his obedience and that of his subjects, including the Irish under direct Anglo-Norman rule, to Henry. In theory, this made Henry king over the whole of Ireland. This agreement hardly led to the end of violence, however. For many Anglo-Normans, this was just the beginning. It's not uncommon in environments of expansion for ventures like this to explode into chain reactions. Circumstances change quickly, and adventurers arise to take advantage of opportunities. Whether they're dissatisfied with their current situation or they're inspired by the success of others, many arise to follow suit. Now, many do fail, but a few will succeed, and those successes inspire others. And this is exactly what happened in Ireland. The Anglo-Normans were inspired not only by Strongbow, but by those who came before as well. The previous generation of Norman knights took southern Wales, those before took England. At the same time, there were other Normans who had taken southern Italy, and others were making names for themselves fighting on behalf of the Byzantine Empire. There were also the Crusades, which were in full swing by this point, and which saw many men of various backgrounds make something of themselves. Each was inspired by the other, and for this current generation of Anglo-Norman knights in Ireland, this was the chance to make their own mark. It was also made easier by the ideas they held about the Irish, which I mentioned earlier. They were trekking into the unknown, the wild, bringing civilization and order to a chaotic land. And, significantly, they were bringing proper Christianity, since their views of the Irish as religiously backward made it easy to give religious support to their cause. Again, this was their perception, how they saw themselves. A great example of this is John de Courcy, who in 1177 gathered a bunch of bored, disgruntled, and restless men from the garrison of Dublin, 20 knights and 300 footmen, and ventured forth to Ullaid, which was regularly embroiled in local conflict. He defeated the king Ruaidhri MacDuine Slieve, seized Downpatrick, and established himself as the local lord. Henry and his successors tried to rein in the Normans, for example by making his son Prince John the Lord of Ireland, but this didn't put a stop to things. In any case, the kings were often much more interested in recognizing these conquests as legitimate in exchange for pledges of loyalty than actually preventing them. This period of Anglo-Norman expansion lasted until around 1235, when Richard de Burgh took parts of Connacht. By then, about 2/3 of Ireland was under Anglo-Norman lordship, and the rest was under Gaelic Irish kings, who at this point didn't really acknowledge English rule since clearly that didn't do anything for them anyway. We shouldn't necessarily look at things from a purely native versus conqueror perspective, though, because the truth is, the reality was often far more complicated than that. Even though Normans were establishing themselves in Irish lands, the relatively independent nature of a lot of these ventures meant that oftentimes they were more integrating themselves into existing Irish politics rather than completely changing them. This was especially true of those who had no lands back in England, and this became more common as time went on since families might split their Irish and English lands between two heirs or even sell some of it off simply because it was too difficult to administer it both effectively, especially for the lower nobility. In these cases, we often see Norman lords and knights taking part in cattle raids, an age-old Irish tradition, and serving as allies to Irish kings in their own wars against each other. In some cases, like the Succession War in Connacht in 1201, there were Normans siding with each contender to the throne and fighting against one another. Inter-Norman conflict in Ireland was not all that uncommon, and it actually came to be a bit of a problem. Larger wars between the great lords often involved one side angering the king, who then tried to reduce their power, after which the lord rose in rebellion, with another rising in support of the king. This was often a result of the fact that the kings of England had very little direct control over Ireland, and power was mostly in the hands of the great lords. Some kings were fine with this, and even gave the lords more autonomy, while others tried to rein them in, but they always maintained a large degree of independence. Ireland eventually got its own parliament in Dublin, and its own court, and it was usually led by a justiciar who stood in for the king. In practice, the justiciar was often either the Bishop of Dublin or one of the Anglo-Irish lords, though occasionally the king might send one of his sons or some other man from England. But the Norman lords didn't just become Irish. They changed the landscape and structure of Ireland where they went, and most strongly around the southern and eastern coasts. Lands were divided feudally, manors granted to knights, Forests and marshes were cleared to make the land more productive for grain. Monasteries, which were more Frankish in organization, were endowed, although Irish kings had begun to support Cistercian and Benedictine houses even before the invasion, but now they were in greater numbers. One of the most visible changes to the landscape was the construction of castles, which were seen by Norman lords as a must in order to maintain their authority in their new lands. Lots of wooden castles were built, and a few stone ones in areas of great importance. There were also new towns, and those which already existed, especially Dublin, grew. Even the Irish kings outside of Anglo-Norman influence began to adopt some of these customs after seeing how successful the Normans had been. Now, in these Norman lands, the Irish obviously didn't just disappear. The ruling dynasties were largely pushed out and replaced, but most everyone else remained. But they were also joined by new immigrants, from England especially, but also Scotland, Wales, Normandy, and even Flanders. These people settled mainly in towns, both older ones like Dublin, which became very anglicized, and new towns established and chartered especially along rivers in the south and east, like Kilkenny, which had long been the site of an Irish church, and Tipperary. In total, we know of around 240 chartered towns in Ireland, although many of these were likely no more than villages which were given charters to attract settlers by guaranteeing certain legal rights. The Irish remained the majority, especially in the countryside and especially as one got further from the coast. But there was a difference in cultural prestige, and many well-off Irish people tended towards Anglicization in order to better their social position. Many of them took on English names and styles, and for some, especially those who came to towns and hoped to gain burgher status, they would begin to adopt English as their first language over several generations. For most, though, Anglicization didn't go so far as to become fully English. Most Irish people who spoke English likely did so as a second language. But cultural influence also didn't only go one way. Some English immigrants and descendants of immigrants eventually adopted Gaelic clothing and hairstyles, and some even started to speak the language. We even hear of Norman lords who wrote Gaelic poetry. In most interactions outside of English towns, and likely even some within these towns, Irish Gaelic was likely the language being used, especially as time went on. But it would be disingenuous to say that everything was all rosy between the native Irish and the immigrant Anglo-Normans. The Irish were no strangers to social hierarchy, and Irish kingdoms had degrees of legal freedom and unfreedom just like England had. For some, especially the unfree, nothing really changed. But for the free and for landholders, nothing was guaranteed. The Normans didn't recognize land ownership unless it had been confirmed after they'd taken over. It's likely that several landowners had managed to get their rights confirmed by their new rulers, especially if said rulers needed local support. But for many, their land could have been seized and given to a new English knight who'd helped their lord in their conquest. We don't have a whole lot of information about how this all played out, unfortunately. However, by the end of the initial conquest period, that is, the second quarter of the 13th century, we hear of English people arguing that the Irish shouldn't be allowed to sue in common law courts because they're, as a whole, not free men. This might not have been strictly true for all of them, but it still speaks to the fact that they were seen this way, likely due to the fact that so many of them held servile positions as tenant farmers in the countryside and laborers in the towns. It's possible that they had more rights initially and that things degraded as time went on. The most successful landowners and other men of free status could have been granted English legal status in the first few generations and may have quickly anglicized because of it. But by the later years of the 13th century, Irish people were not legally allowed to inherit land because they didn't have access to common law. Likewise, there were Irish craftsmen and merchants in the countryside and even in some towns, and these men were technically free, but being Irish, they still had a lower legal status. Now, an Irish person could get English legal status, but this would have to be granted to them. Oftentimes this was done through purchase, and so it was usually the most wealthy who obtained it. This gave them access to common law courts, which meant they could sue an Englishman and get recompense for an offense against them, and they could inherit land. By default, though, an Irish person was not legally English. Anyone who didn't have this status had to rely on the support of their lord if they had a case in a common law court. So they weren't completely devoid of rights, but it wasn't ideal, and compensation went to their lord, not them. They essentially had the same legal status in this regard as a serf. If they didn't have a lord, then they had to rely on some other patron who had legal status. So, by the late 13th century, you had this weird situation where differences between the Anglo-Normans and the Irish were in some ways shrinking as their cultures meshed, but there were still limits to how much that could be. These limitations got more harsh as time went on. The Statutes of Kilkenny in 1366, for example, forbade anyone in English towns from speaking Gaelic, wearing Irish clothes, hairstyles, or even riding a horse without a saddle in the Irish fashion. They also forbade any Englishmen to marry an Irish woman and forbade the observation of Irish law. Around that same time, you have more towns forbidding citizenship to the Irish, defined by whether they have any Irish grandparents, and guilds forbidding Irish people from joining as well. Some areas even forbade any Irish from moving there at all. But these were ideals more than realities. The Statutes of Kilkenny were hardly enforced, and hardly even enforceable. They were also established by Lionel of Clarence, who was the son of King Edward III, and not a local Anglo-Irishman, and they reflect an outsider's attempt to change the situation which many in Ireland had come to live with. You see, at the same time as these legal attempts to sharpen increasingly fuzzy boundaries, English royal power over Ireland was plummeting. By the late 13th century, England had been distracted by wars in Scotland and France, and were forced to let Ireland do its own thing. At the same time, internal Norman conflict and division had weakened local power, and Gaelic kings once again began taking land from the English. All of this was exacerbated by things like the Great Famine in the 1310s and the Black Death in the middle of the century, which hurt the more densely populated and developed English lands more strongly than the more rural Irish ones. At the same time, you have the 100 Years' War with France taking English attention and manpower. All of these factors meant that, for practical reasons, there were more and more Irish in positions of influence, and the English were becoming weary of their own place. The government in Dublin was becoming afraid of the Irish becoming more powerful, of Irish kings raiding their towns, of their own people starting to speak Gaelic and dress as Irishmen. How long until they joined the Gaelic kings? Treachery was a common trait amongst the Irish, after all. Hopefully it's becoming clear by now that the simultaneous increase and harshening of legislation against the Irish and the general increase in their position and presence — we see, for example, more and more Irish names amongst plaintiffs in legal records — is not a paradox, but actually very closely intertwined. I could go into this even more, like noting how it became more common for Irishmen to be bishops at the same time as the government is trying to forbid priests from preaching in Irish, fearing that they might incite rebellion. But I think you get the idea. This isn't to say that in reality on the ground everyone was getting along. That would be a huge oversimplification. There was still plenty of discrimination and division. But the general status of the Irish vis-à-vis the English in Ireland was potentially getting better, and there was a greater degree of cultural hybridization. By the 15th century, there was a concern in England that English power in Ireland was collapsing. The great Norman lords had mostly become autonomous, and England could only really control an area in the east that would come to be known as the Pale, a name first recorded in 1446. English power over the rest of Ireland had degraded so much that in 1454 they began to construct a series of fortresses around its border. But even here, in the Pale, ideal and reality remained different. Despite many anti-Irish laws passed in the Irish Parliament, lots of people continued to speak Gaelic, even amongst the English, and Irish immigrants moved in from outside, taking up much-needed jobs in fields and in the streets of Dublin, even some in the upper echelons of society. This, of course, is not the end of the story, but it is the end of the Middle Ages, so it's going to be where this video comes to its end. By the start of the early modern period, England had very little hold over Ireland. What it did have, however, was a claim. A claim that Ireland was rightfully the possession of the kings of England. A claim which, slightly modified, would lead to Henry VIII re-establishing a firm hold over Ireland, to Cromwell marching his armies in 100 years later, and ultimately to the integration of Ireland into the United Kingdom in 1801. The end of the Middle Ages was only the end of one chapter in the long and complicated history of Anglo-Irish relations. I'll see you next time.